Welcome, everyone, from the Global Labor Research Center here at York and our co-sponsors, the York University's Department of Politics, the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change, and Work and Labor Studies program. I'm Luann Good-Gingrich. I'm the director of the Global Labor Research Center here at York, and we're pleased to be hosting this discussion with the co-editor and contributors to the recently published book entitled Canadian Labor Policy and Politics, edited by John Peters and Don Wells. So the program for today, I will first pose a series of questions to invite discussion with the 5 authors who have joined us today, and I will introduce them shortly. 6, there are 6 now, sorry. Which is excellent. And then you all will have an opportunity, those online as well as those in the room here, to ask your questions. Please do hold your questions until the Q&A time. Those of you who are in the room here with us, I invite you to stay following our discussion for refreshments and also an opportunity to meet or catch up with each other and also the presenters for today. So I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists, our authors for today. Carlo Fanelli is an assistant professor and coordinator of the Work and Labor Studies program in the Department of Social Science at York University. Andrea Noack is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Toronto Metropolitan University, and Andrea is on Zoom. And we can't see her at the moment. You will see her when she speaks. Andrew, what? Okay. John Peters is a research fellow at the Inter-University Research Center on Globalization and Work at the University of Montreal. Mark Thomas is professor and chair in the Department of Sociology at York University and also the former director of the Global Labor Research Center. Stephen Tufts is professor in environmental geography and environmental and urban change. Is that right? Close enough. And Leah Vosko is professor of political science and the Canada Research Chair in the political economy of gender and work at York University. So thank you all for joining us today and giving us this opportunity to join in conversation with you about your book. So I'm going to begin by noting my observations about the importance and the timeliness of this book. We see the steady polarization and fragmentation of the labor market in Canada. And several contributors to this book have been writing about this for 20 years or more. And it appears that perhaps things are getting worse, or things are changing anyway, perhaps getting worse for workers rather than better. You note in the book the urgency of this issue in Canada, where the fusion between the market and the state, and also the joining together or the fusion between the public and the private, is expanding and deepening in varied manifestations. You write that we see this in the growing scope and influence of business and wealthy elites, the shift in public policy and labor laws away from promoting the collective prosperity of the many toward the profits of the few, and in the trend toward deregulation and a so-called free market approach to law and policy. You point out that the narrative, or sometimes the accusation, of a strong collective consciousness and social welfare government in Canada is a myth. I appreciate the precise analyses and the case examples from the service sector to manufacturing to healthcare to care work to green jobs. And I also appreciate the practical recommendations for change, specific policy alternatives to address precarious employment, to extend better employment conditions, to promote greater equality, and to address climate change. It's an ambitious book, and I look forward to reading it in its entirety. So now I want to invite the contributors to the book who are with us today to tell us a little about what you want us to learn from the book. And I'll first mention those of you in the room, please do help yourselves to refreshments as we begin our discussion. So John, I'll begin with you. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the origins of the book. What spurred you to pull this project together? Why do you think we need to think seriously about Canadian labor and employment policy and the political context and how to make it better? And why now?
Well, I think you just mentioned a few points about what the book is trying to do. But before I go, just in terms of the origins, I just want to thank so much to the Global Labor Research Center for hosting the book launch and to the Department of Politics, Environment, and Urban Change, as well as the Work and Labor Studies program, and my alma mater, York University, which I still feel is my home and intellectual home, right? Political home in many ways. So I think, York and my training at York, as well as I think many of my colleagues at York, was to think, what are the problems and what are the solutions? And I think this is what the origins of this book really sort of begin with. What are the problems that we're facing at work? Why do we face them? And, I would like to say that the COVID pandemic provided me with all kinds of time, away from teaching or from research to say, oh, well, we have time now to write a book, but that wasn't quite how it worked out. But certainly the COVID pandemic was a major spur and a major theme, I think, in looking at the book. I mean, if you look at what was happening to workers throughout the pandemic, the lack of sick days that people had, the lack of testing, the lack of support that they actually had, I thought all of these kinds of issues were key to work. And the fact that we didn't have those kinds of supports, I thought was something that we really needed to investigate. But even before that, I think, as all my co-contributors here, write about, I mean, Canada has one of the worst, most unequal labor markets. It's both precarious, it's low wage, and people just don't have the kinds of social supports that are there. So I think that was the issue, the other issue of inequality, is trying to sort of discuss that and discuss this with a number of case studies, right, and try to sort of bring that really home and bring that out. But the other issue I think that everyone has been grappling with is the climate crisis. And everywhere you look, it's those who don't have union protection and those who are in poor jobs and in poor communities or in resource-dependent communities, that they're the ones who are often suffering from the climate crisis. But saying that, of course, at the other side of that is that it's a Green New Deal is something that would often we would hope provide opportunity and provide new prospects for workers everywhere. So how did that happen? So I think there's those kinds of big problems, of COVID, of the climate crisis, and inequality, I think, that we wanted to address. That was the first sort of thing. And I think we also wanted to offer solutions. I think it's too often, so, in progressive circles, we often talk about the problems, but we don't talk about the solutions. So I really wanted to have a book that, spoke to many of these kinds of solutions to workers or to unions about how we need to improve our labor law, or how we should try to improve our minimum wages, or how should we try to think about, redesigning our temporary foreign work programs, right? So, and provide real case examples about what are the good solutions, right? And then, of course, how do we think about how do we get there? And I think that's the other really key part, and think about what kinds of politics are necessary, what kinds of collective actions we need to actually see these kinds of changes to the kinds of work and the kinds of society and the kinds of democracy that we have, right? So those were the sort of the spurs of it. And then, at the end of it, I also wanted to have a nice book. I wanted to have a good book with figures and the stories that people could relate to and people would read and get something really out of. So those were the origins of the book, about trying to sort of put something together that I think that would be worthwhile for students, for our students, for workers, for a general public, for journalists that we're all looking at. And then to some degree, I think we were reasonably successful. I did see that the Ottawa Parliamentary online reporting investigative journalism organization, Hill Times, nominated our book as one of the best of 2022. So I thought that was really worthwhile. So that's the good ideas. And of course comes the next part, which you actually have to say, please, my colleagues, what do you think about joining us? And do you have the patience, or do you have any of the space that you can get us to do that? And I was very pleased, and I was really honored that everyone, especially here, and my friends and colleagues were able to join us. As not only that, but friends and colleagues from across Canada as well, to actually do this project and stay with us in trying to create this kind of book. And I'm very happy that they did, and I'm very happy about the launch now today.
Great, thanks. Carlo, I'm going to direct my next question to you. I'd like to pick up on one of the themes that you and Brian Evans wrote about in your chapter, Low Wage Work. I think many readers would be surprised by the prevalence and the severity of low-paying jobs in Canada, and that as a country, we compare so poorly to many other nations in the world. So this, I think, is eye-opening. It's important for us to recognize. It might not fit with what we tell ourselves about Canada. So can you say a bit about how Canada compares and why the problem is as it is in Canada?
Thanks, Luann. I think that's a great question. Well, this thing is loud. Well, I guess, if we were to think about three things that this chapter really tries to do is, theoretically, we try to show how this concept of low-wage work situated historically is not the word escapes me, of course, right now, like historically specific, but part and parcel of the way capitalism reproduces itself historically, and what we typically refer to as the standard employment relationship, as that period which defines work from the mid-1940s to the 1970s, is in fact the historical anomaly, not the standard. The standard is low-waged work, and this has been globalized across space, and we've seen this, this process deepening and generalizing itself ever more so, particularly since the 1970s and 80s. I mean, methodologically, we were presented with this challenge because we were trying to compare Canada in an international context. And internationally, the general sentiment is Canada is this high tax, generous welfare state nation, when in reality, in many ways, it couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, how you go about measuring low-wage work is not as straightforward as one would seem. I mean, the OECD measures low-wage work as 66% of median earnings. The EU measures it as 60%. Some studies look at it as 1.5 times the minimum wage if there's a statutory minimum wage in the jurisdiction. Others look at 50% of the average wage. So there's no easy statistical way to kind of measure how you go about evaluating the low wages. And what we did was we adopted the OECD's measure in this study for comparative purposes, looking where Canada ranks. In Canada, while we like to say we're not last when it comes to the largest proportion, or rather, we're not first as far as the largest proportion of low-wage earners, which is between 1/5 and 1/4 of Canadians, depending on how you measure it. We're by no means near the best as far as having an absence of low-wage work. And I guess just to conclude, I guess our biggest finding was that the two largest indicators in trying to identify if a jurisdiction was going to have a high predominance of low-wage work was tied to, one, collective bargaining coverage, but surprisingly, the other largest factor was public sector expenditures. And those were the two biggest indicators of whether or not a proportion of individuals or workers in a jurisdiction were likely to be low wage. In Canada, unfortunately, whether compared across the OECD or jurisdictionally across cities, regions, provinces, tends to rate amongst the highest as far as concentrations of low-wage workers.
Okay, gives us pause then. Mark Thomas and Stephen Tufts, I'll turn to you next. And I'll just mention that I'm seeing in the chat that it's much easier for people to hear with the lapel mics than the other mics, unless you hold the mic closer to your mouth. So we know that bad jobs in Canada are not only about less than adequate wages. We see more and more precarious employment that is low wage, of course, but also part-time, no union protections, temporary or bogus self-employment jobs with little to no opportunity. And we see more and more of these across Canada's labor market. So both of you, I was really struck in your chapter about how widespread precarious employment is in Canada's service sector in particular. It looks like this is a huge problem. And why? How did we get here?
Sure, I'll start. I don't know if we can answer the historical part of the question, Luann, but thanks for that. We'll try to respond as best as possible. I want to preface this by a couple of things, just saying that this chapter was really interesting to write, and it was a unique piece of writing for me, with thanks to John and Don for pushing us in this direction. Because I haven't really done sectorally specific research before. So this was new and interesting in that way, and a chance to explore some themes that had been, part of other work I'd been involved in, but in a way that was really directed at this particular sector of the economy. Before talking about the service or the particular problem around precarious employment in the service sector, I think one of the things the chapter tries to do is to trouble the notion of homogeneity within the sector. And while we end up focusing on aspects of precarious employment in some kinds of service jobs, we do note that the service sector is quite diverse, and so there are a range of employment experiences that are present within service kinds of jobs. And the chapter really sort of draws a focus around some particular forms of work in the service economy where we see higher levels of precariousness. The other thing that we try to do is to give a little bit of specificity to that. And so what does it mean when we're talking about precarious work in the service economy? And Carlo had mentioned the situation of low wages as one example or one indicator of this. And in the chapter, we try to identify particular areas of service sector work where there are high incidence of low wages, but also combined with other aspects of precariousness as well, job insecurity, lack of regulatory protection, for example. And here the chapter really starts to narrow its attention around jobs in sectors like food services, accommodation services, retail services, these kinds of things. And when we get into looking at these particular spaces in the service economy, we can see some common patterns that begin to develop. For example, around the prevalence of low wages. And so I can't provide stats off the top of my head, but the chapter, and here's a good reason to go and buy the book because you get all these tables, right? The chapter goes into some of the cutting edge up-to-date statistics in the service sector that document low wage employment. And also, of course, the lack of unionization, which becomes a really key factor. Again, and this is something where we kind of break apart the service sector because there are some service sector jobs, if we get into the public service sector, for example, where levels of unionization are really high. And so we bracket that out, but we look at parts of the service sector where there is very, very low levels of unionization. And again, looking at accommodations or food services, retail, et cetera. And so looking at precarious work in that way in the service sector, we can see the meaning of what the book sort of captures under this phrase of bad jobs in very particular ways. So there's one pattern there, but the other really important pattern I think that the chapter tries to highlight is the ways in which these experiences are quite gendered and quite racialized. And so, and again, just without being able to get into the statistical details myself off the top of my head, we do note these kinds of patterns, right, of heightened levels of precariousness within particular parts of the service sector where there are high levels of employment of women, people of color, recent immigrants, for example. And then without going on for too long, I'll just say one more thing that the chapter tries to do, and that is to tie this into the conditions and experiences within the service economy related to COVID-19. And another clear pattern starts to come through here where the levels of precariousness and the kinds of precariousness that were experienced prior to COVID-19, we could see really exacerbated kinds of experiences, again, in some of these particular spaces. So I'll stop there, but perhaps my co-author would like to add more detail.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, when we were writing this chapter, I was thinking, especially rewriting the drafts as the pandemic was taking hold. I was doing a lot of work and continue to do work with airport workers. That influenced some of my thinking about the service sector and the different uneven impacts of the pandemic on people in Canada and abroad. And I think one lesson we learned from COVID-19 is that COVID-19 did not create precarity. It had nothing to do with precarity. It accentuated precarity. It took advantage of precarity, but it had nothing to do with creating precarity. It was long before. And I think what I like about this book in general is that COVID-19 runs through the chapters, but it doesn't dominate. It's not a book about work and the pandemic, because the pandemic is going to eventually change. It's still with us. It's going to have differential impacts, but the underlying structures of the service sector and others are going to be persistent with us. And the COVID-19 pandemic did accentuate things in the airport. And it also highlighted the fragmentation of the service sector that we get into in the chapter. It's a service sector that's very diverse. It's labor market segmentation by race, gender, education, ability is persistent and accentuated. And the difference between public and private sector impacts from the pandemic were quite pronounced. I've written about this before. Many of us in this room, the pandemic is very difficult. We complained about having to teach online. We didn't miss too many paychecks. A lot of folks in other sectors did. And the impact of that just accentuated these divides and fragments. That leads to the other theme in the chapter we talked about, is the impact of the service sector on growing populism and what their response should be. And we could see throughout the pandemic, the populist sentiments, the anti-vaxxing, anti-masking, anti-lockdown sentiments was coming from a whole bunch of range of different places. And there was some links to how that was affecting your workplace. So there were groups that one of the references here is a group that started on Facebook of displaced aviation workers during the pandemic. And within 7 days, they went from 0 followers to 12,000. And throughout the pandemic, there was a lot of expressions of frustration with the state, how they dealt with the airline shutdown, what the CERB difficulties and limitations were. And I think that's one of the lessons that we have to learn from this book and others, is that the growth of right-wing populism in general includes workers. And why is that? And what kind of fragmentation, racism is persistent within our workforce that it's going to make it very difficult to dial the Trumpism, Oliverism, if we're calling it that yet, back.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. So Leah, Vosko, and Andie Noack, I turn to the two of you now. And your chapter with Adam King and Rebecca Hill, you note that precarious employment is also a big problem for federally regulated industries like airlines and railroads, postal services. And you note that the federally regulated private sector has historically been more worker-friendly in terms of collective bargaining and some labor standards than its provincial counterparts. Many people assume that if you have a federal job, you have a good job, right? But this is obviously not the case.
Sure, I'll start, Andie, if that's okay. So our chapter, Precarious Employment in the Federally Regulated Private Sector, looks at what I think is a really underexplored terrain in Canada, and that is the experience of people that are in the federal jurisdiction, but in the private sector. So not people with federal government jobs, right, but rather people that are in the private sector. And part of the reason we wanted to do this work is that we wanted to look at what has been historically, I'll say well, in quotation marks, relatively well regulated terrain compared to other jurisdictions in Canada. That is, in the federally regulated jurisdiction in general, historically, certain labor and employment protections have been stronger. So there have been stronger protections against unfair dismissal, longer leaves, and in some cases, some have argued that certain kinds of wage setting activities at the federal level have been more progressive. So we wanted to look at how workers in this jurisdiction are faring. And this jurisdiction really, it covers interprovincial industries like telecommunications, banking, road transport, and mining, et cetera. So it's for people that cross borders either literally or figuratively every day. So what we did is we looked at what has happened in recent years through a multi-method approach, looking at an analysis of data of an underexplored survey. And then we looked historically at the reasons for the jurisdictional divisions between federal and provincial private sectors. And what we found largely was that it's true. Historically, this has been a better regulated domain. And part of the reason is that the firms have been larger. The people in the sector, very typical, people have spoken of a standard employment relationship and often associated with a full-time, full-year job, complete with benefits that's held among white male citizen workers. Well, if there ever were a prototype historically of this sector, it would have been the federally regulated private sector. But what we found is that in recent years, there's been a growth of pockets of precariousness in this sector. So in particular in road transport, where issues such as working time, like my good colleague Mark has written about, there are big cracks in the sector around road transport. So there's a big misclassification of jobs problem in road transport. At the same time, we have seen the growth of fissuring of employment relationships, greater subcontracting, and distancing strategies that have affected sectors like banking, where there's, one employing entity, but then there were many different subcontracting relationships. And so that a lot of telecommunications as well, and even mining, where you also see a growth, John mentioned at the outset, a focus on temporary foreign work, or migrant work, which is a focus of my own work at the moment. There's, there's been a lot of developments in those sectors that have really encroached upon the federally regulated private sector and its workers. So the result is a fair bit of polarization. I'll let Andie speak about this maybe more, but where certain sectors remain relatively protected domains, but there's a growth of pockets of precarity, especially in road transport, which is one of the largest components of the federally regulated private sector, in banking. And I would say that with respect to the last one, especially in banking and telecommunications, those are also industries where paradoxically women and people of color have made inroads. So that this downward harmonization that's taking place in the federally regulated private sector is very much gendered and racialized. So we see this sort of paradox of, women and people of color, recent immigrants enter a particular domain, and then the bottom falls out of this domain. And so we basically contend that the federally regulated private sector could be a place where a model jurisdiction, and with greater efforts at minimum wage setting and other kinds of things, that this could be, but with a lack of proactive employment standards enforcement, with a lack of decent penalties for employers that violate job conditions, and with this growth of misclassification, it doesn't live up to its promise. But we suggest that it could potentially, this could change. And certainly John and Dawn encouraged us to talk about agency and to think about these questions. And yeah, so it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting us to participate in this volume. And maybe Andie will add her 2 cents.
Sure. So I'd say one of the things I'd want to add to that is the importance of the federal jurisdiction in Canada as a point of comparison for provincial labor codes. So the federal jurisdiction really has often been a leader in pushing provinces to improve their labor standards. And federally regulated workers have provided a point of comparison in things like collective bargaining. So they really have served as this model jurisdiction, which is one of the reasons we are particularly concerned about the potential for the bottom to fall out of it because of this erosion and decline. I will say just a little bit more methodologically in terms of what we actually did in the chapter, which is to really dig down and compare the public sector, so what we traditionally think of as public sector workers, to the federally regulated public sector, and then to the provincially regulated public sector. And we focused on several different dimensions of difference. They're certainly not the only ones that we could have focused on, but they're the ones that we chose to highlight. So we looked at things like employment and self-employment, firm size, job tenure, low wages, and union coverage. And we find that in general, so much like in the public sector, in the federally regulated private sector, there's very little self-employment. So almost everyone is an employee. And the big exception here is in road transport, where we have lots of independent contractors. in terms of firm size, in terms of job tenure, and even in terms of wages, the federally regulated public sector really resembles the public sector more so than the provincially regulated private sector. But the big difference is union coverage, right? So in the public sector, of course, in Canada, we have a long history of unionization in the public sector. But the federally regulated private sector has much lower levels of union coverage, and that's, of course, not accidental. And in fact, is one of the reasons why these pockets of precariousness have started to make inroads and have started to grow, is the lower and in fact decreasing, it seems like, unionization in industries like airlines. So I think that's sort of my contribution there, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it later.
Great, thank you. So I want to come back to John now. All of these issues, really concerning trends that we see in Canada. You point out that none of this is inevitable, right? I think it's fairly common to think about the labor market and the economy as if they have a life of their own, or as if they're outside of anyone's control. You point out that our labor laws and employment policies, which are, of course, very much determined by people, are producing the structure of the labor market and the everyday conditions of work. And above all, you point out widespread job precarity is the direct result of the political choices of our provincial and federal governments. Yet workers in other countries seem to be doing better, and you cite countries such as Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, where policymakers have not chosen to go down this low road, in contrast to Canada. And you mentioned that labor market deregulation is the go-to option for most governments across Canada. So why? Why are Canada's public officials choosing to deregulate labor markets when they could be doing the opposite and creating better jobs?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we like to point out is that it's money talks. Right? And I think the nature of how money talks differs across countries. And certainly you can see in both Canada and the United States how business influences grow, right? And certainly the push towards having lower cost labor, or having labor that's going to be on demand, or that's going to be part-time, or that doesn't have benefits. All of this, right, has come with concerted business effort over time to say, look, this is the kinds of results that we want in our labor force. We want to improve profits here. How can we go about making those changes? And I think one of the things I really wanted to try and bring out in this book is that there's lots of different ways that you can do this when you're a big business or you're a small business, as well as to bring out some of the real political aspects about actually trying to make this happen. So one of the ways, if you're a multinational corporation, is that you might want to subcontract and take some of these workers off your books. And then if you use a contracting agency, then they can use part-time or use temporary employment. And in that way, then you can also get out of some of your union collective agreements, right? And your union, right? Okay, so that's one particular kind of strategy. Or you might look to actually hire more workers on a temporary basis, right? Well, if you're a major employer in a service sector and you want to do this, well, you have to make this consideration. Are we going to get penalized? Is someone going to actually come back to us? Well, instead of then worrying about that, you could actually just make sure that your service agency or your service association or your chamber of commerce talks about, well, we should have less enforcement because this is bad for business and bad for competitiveness, right? So I think the sort of the influence of business is tremendously important about how we've gone down this road towards low wage work and precarious work, and that there's lots of different ways, whether it's labor law reform, whether it's changes to employment standards, or whether it's the non-enforcement of employment standards, or you can begin to carve out new types of employment relationships, whether that's for temporary foreign workers or for domestic workers or for care workers, right? So in all these kinds of ways, then you can fissure what Leah has really written well about, the standard employment relationship, and that will sort of govern on this idea that we should have good jobs. Well, that's gone by the board. It's not about having good jobs. It's about having flexible and low cost and competitive type jobs for much of economic policy. So I think that's really the one thing that we wanted to point out. But I think if we're going to make the comparison, then I think we also have to say, why is it that we've gone down this road so quickly if we compare ourselves to some of the Scandinavian countries? And they're starting at a much higher bar, right? Much more of their labor force was unionized. Their labor unions were much wider and more powerful and better resourced. And they also then had much greater support and much greater success with their political parties, whether social democratic or socialist, or in coalition governments, and winning good labor laws and winning good labor standards. And it's been much more difficult in those cases, even though business wants low costs there as well. It's been much more difficult for them to win those kinds of reforms, given the nature of the institutions and given the strength of the labor movement. And I think that's the other part. And then the last part, I think, is that we're also in this sort of feedback effect now, right? We're having long-term, seeing the long-term consequences of what happens when you begin to successfully deregulate your labor market. Well, you'll create as a new standard for businesses, for employers. Well, if they're getting a low-cost temporary foreign worker, we should get the same thing too. Or if they don't have to work with a collective agreement, why don't we just go out and use contract labor ourselves? So that you have a new sort of sense of that. But once you do that, that begins to, as we've mentioned, fragment and polarize the workforce. And I think what happens is that the more people are put into precarious types of positions, the more they're having to scramble to meet their livelihoods. The more they're having to sort of trying to worry about meeting rent, the less they're actually collectively can actually do, right? The less that they're actually able to work and say, okay, well, we're all going to work, we're going to take a strike. Or, you know what, trying to get a union in this workplace could threaten my job and I can't do that anymore. Or I can't attend a political meeting. So what polarization and fragmentation and precarity in the labor market does is it begins to marginalize or exclude people from politics and from unions and from collective organization and solidarity. So that I refer to that as sort of a post-democracy process, that people are being excluded out of this and that business is being more and more successful because of what labor market deregulation is doing. Because they get low-cost labor, they get better profits and they can push for more deregulation across the board. But in doing that, then they also then take some of those political resources and capacities away from working people and from unions to be able to successfully maintain those labor laws and good employment standards, and also not just to defend them, but actually trying to push forward and improve them. So that's the sort of the process I think that we really want to try and understand. And I think that's really important that we think about, yes, this is politically created. Yes, this is a political choice, but you know what? If it is, then we can find ways to try and change those laws and try to change that kind of paradigm. And that's really one of the things I think we want to try and do in this book as well, and try to get across to students and to working people as well.
Right. So making better choices. Leah and Andie, turn back to you again. You've both written a lot about the problems with our employment standards. So how can we go about fixing these? How can we go about making better policies?
Okay, well, maybe I'll talk about this is related to the federally regulated private sector, given that that's the focus of our topic of our paper, Andie. But we can, some of the things that I think we prescribe, and I say we because I've worked with Andie long enough to think that there's maybe a bit of a we here. Looking at the federally regulated private sector, and also looking at it as a window into developments in the labor market, indicates to me that there are 4 or 5 things that we could do that are sort of consistent with what John is pushing at. One is this, it's a really key marker, as Andie underlined, of misclassification. So a big problem in the labor market is people that are workers, that are working for remuneration. And like a lot of us have done work on this for many years. And they're workers, but they might be called self-employed or a little bit better, dependent contractors. But that means that they don't have access to a range of labor protections. They don't have limits on their working time or access to overtime in most jurisdictions, including in the federal jurisdictions. There are certain sectoral regulations that make them vulnerable in a range of different ways. We have, I think, a lot of scholarly and on-the-ground knowledge that the division between assuming that being a worker is being an employee, and being a self-employed person is being an entrepreneur is a false dichotomy. And so the federally regulated jurisdiction, in the federally regulated jurisdiction, private sector, what we see is this problem really manifesting itself in road transport. So there are many people that are making all kinds of health and safety compromised decision-making in terms of health and safety, and what, for example, and because they can't get overtime pay or whatnot. This is an example of why we need a presumption of employee status, like assuming that people, if we're not going to have something better than that, at a minimum, a presumption that people who are doing these jobs are working for remuneration and therefore deserve labor protection. And so in the the minor study that we've done, we see it really manifest in road transport. So that's one area. The other thing is that Andie mentioned, and one of the reasons we looked at this is because we wanted to look at what a model jurisdiction once looked like, or if it could be a model jurisdiction, the federal jurisdiction. Same with minimum wages. So since we wrote our chapter, now the federal government has come in and they've said, you know, the minimum wage, I think it's $15.55, Andie, am I right? And to be indexed, there is a minimum wage in the federally regulated private sector. Sorry, it's a real mouthful. Is $15.55, and it's indexed, and every April 1st it's going to go up. So this is a great thing in the sense of making the federal jurisdiction a model jurisdiction, even though there aren't that many minimum wage workers. There are a fair number of low wage workers, but there aren't that many minimum wage workers there. So we could try to use these kind of strategic entry points to argue for decent minimum wages, which is a big problem that Carlo and John and others have shown as well. And then the other thing that is, I think, really important is about the compliance. You raised this, like with employment standards. So in the federally regulated private sector, like in most provincial jurisdictions, there's a compliance orientation to employment standards enforcement. That is, we just assume that employers are going to comply, but we mustn't. And the federal jurisdiction is also an exemplar here, that, you know, there's a lot of violations of employment standards, complaints and such in road transport, in banking, and all these sectors. And it's not enough to simply assume that employers are going to enforce the labor law. And so therefore we need to have this, you know, proactive inspections and other kinds of mechanisms, meaningful penalties. Now they've introduced more administrative and monetary penalties in the federally regulated private sector since we wrote the chapter a little bit. Hopefully they'll mean that employers won't want to break the law. The cost of breaking the law will not be so minimal that they'll do it. Like there'll be examples. So administrative and monetary penalties, like our colleague Eric Tucker has written about, I think, really quite forcefully. And then, of course, unionization, that we obviously could use the federally regulated private sector to push for unionization. Andie underlined shockingly low rates of unionization in the federally regulated private sector. And yet at the same time, you know, our federal government, in theory, and certainly federal public sector workers have high rates of unionization. Here's a place where we should be arguing for, you know, legislation against replacement workers, for example, and other things. So I think that would be where I might place some strategic emphasis and where we might get some traction. Andie?
So yeah, I would just add to that, or re-emphasize the challenges related to enforcement. And this is actually a spot where the federally regulated private sector is not a model. They have exactly the same problems as provincial jurisdictions. And I was struck by John talking about needing to change the laws. And I think as a good first step, we could actually enforce the laws that are actually on the books. At the current moment, people who violate employment standards at the federal level have almost zero chance of being detected unless an employee makes a complaint. And we know that there are, of course, a myriad reasons why employees don't make complaints. And then on top of it, sort of linking back to Leah's comments around penalties, if an employee does complain and they are awarded money, very little happens to the employer. So the employer is told they need to pay, the amount they need to pay is the amount of money they should have paid the employee in the first place. So there's really no deterrent to not paying your employees what they're owed. And then if the employer doesn't actually pay those funds, there's very little recourse for an employee, even if they have a judgment that says, yes, your employer owes you X amount of money. Your option is to go to federal court or tribunal. And many people simply don't have the wherewithal and the resources to do that. So the result is that we have laws on the books that set out minimum labor standards, but there's very little incentive for employers to follow those standards. So even before we start making legislative changes, let's actually make the political commitment and the practical commitment to enforcing the laws that are on the books that are designed to ensure good working conditions.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that. Mark and Stephen, could you say a little bit more about efforts that workers themselves have been making, such as like the Fight for 15 campaign and new organizing drives across the sectors? How hopeful are you about these initiatives, about them, the ability for them to make any headway in addressing low-wage work and precarious employment? So how optimistic are you is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I wish that we find a silver bullet that could bring about an instant increase in standards for working people at federal and provincial levels. One of the things I think we have to be open to is a couple of things. One is, first of all, what this book does quite well, as John clearly laid out, is that the low-wage precarious model takes a lot of resources to reproduce, state, economic, social. It's a hard work to be a low-wage country. We pull it off magnificently. Because when you recognize that, then you can start seeing how to undo and how vulnerable that system is. Our system is vulnerable to generational labor shortage. We don't know what kind of industries might survive if persistent labor shortages are maintained, if the Prime Minister's office can't ramp up immigration to historic levels that we haven't seen before, which is they're trying to do right now. The other thing that we have to talk about is, is populism always bad? We think about right-wing populism, but there's also a counter to left-wing populism. Can the Fight for 15 be a populist movement? Can the Fight for sick days be populist? Can we challenge elites from a left-wing perspective? And what are the downfalls and promises of doing that? Leah and Andie are absolutely right. We have a box in our chapter about contract flipping at airports. And there was significant legislative change to limit contract flipping. For those of you who don't know, it's when a subcontractor comes in, fires everybody, hires everybody the next day, and erases all their wage gains they've made in the previous 2 years. And so it's built into the economic model of how services are supplied at airports, such as baggage handling. Despite the change in legislation, airports are still doing it. Contract flipping is still going on, even though they're not federally allowed to do it, right? Because you have a standards problem. So this is where I think another example of a populist and really rethinking of what is our scale of action. I mean, we talk about a global internationalist perspective from the left up. It's workers of the world unite, not workers of Vaughan or Etobicoke unite. But can we start building gains for workers that might be at a sub-provincial or sub-local scale? So one of the things we're talking about at the airport, we've been fighting for it for over a decade, is about an airport living wage that ignores the 1555, that ignores the 15 provincial and federal limits, says we need a $25 wage for all 50,000 workers or whoever works at Pearson, whether they be provincial or federally regulated. And can we establish that as a model, local model that might then have a demonstration of that? So your scale of action has to be open. And I think that's as unions have come to terms that labor is always locally acted, that there's different ways of launching campaigns and things like that.
Thanks.
Mark, you want to add to that?
Sure, or maybe not add to it, but I'll just respond. I think one of the things that we when we're taking up this question of how to improve conditions of work in the low wage service economy, and what are the sort of the policy answers to this, I think our chapter also maybe alludes to, but doesn't really directly address the significance of collective power in enacting policy shifts. And I think this is a really important point in understanding how policy evolves, and then also why we end up with the policies that we have. And so, for example, there's a brief moment in the chapter that we don't really explore in depth, but we talk about the really significant gains that were made for a brief moment in Ontario around some of the changes, going back to Leah's point about legislated employment standards. And so there was very briefly around 2017 legislation passed by the provincial government of the time that made some significant improvements to employment standards around minimum wage, around a whole range of standards, and including commitments to improve enforcement. And that didn't simply happen because the government was enlightened at the time, but it was the product of a really concerted collective struggle on the part of low-wage workers and their advocates and their organizations like the Workers' Action Center, the campaign, the Fight for $15 in Fairness, and so on, that really built momentum in Ontario, following models that had happened in other cities and regions in North America and also in Western Europe, to create a strong pressure to push the government in that direction. And so there was collective power that brought about that moment of change. But of course, what we saw very soon after that was the collective power of the business class, or can we even say the capitalist class, as they came into power through Doug Ford's government and then eradicated those changes. And so there's those dynamics of struggle that I think are really key. And to bring about the kind of shift that we really need, I think it goes back to a question of how to build, the power of working people in a collective sense to bring about the next shift. And where our chapter, I think, maybe offers some suggestions, including what Steve was just talking about around the question of scale and building from a sort of a regional or an occupational or locational kind of scale that might help to build up. That is one way, perhaps, and also the populist framing of sort of the elites that are the threat to the well-being of working people is perhaps another, but I don't think there's any easy answers. And in the end, it really does come down to the question of what is it going to take to build, the collective power of working people.
It's interesting to think about the possibility of reclaiming the term populism. Carlo, you've written quite a lot about the living wage campaigns and also about the challenges that they face. Can you say a little bit about what you see as the opportunities for unions and workers in sort of pushing things forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like trying to define what a living wage is or what a low-wage worker is, oftentimes it's not that straightforward. For instance, living wage movements vary quite dramatically, not only across Ontario, but across the country as a whole and even internationally. I mean, we conclude in this chapter by arguing that many living wage movements, at least in the Canadian context, have been led by kind of rational policy deliberation, often top-down, which vary quite considerably from movements just south, in the United States, which have often led by historically racialized communities, women, and other vulnerable communities. And this has impacts for how they go about trying to implement public policies. And there's also been a great variation as far as the degree of union involvement, community-based groups, church groups, other faith-based institutions, and nonprofit organizations. The variety of civic actors that have been involved is quite different depending on the jurisdiction. But I think one of the things I really appreciate about this collection generally is that while recognizing the progressive potential of public policies to ameliorate low-waged work and precarious work, it also points to some of its limitations and the perils of a degree on, for instance, regulatory environments, demography, for instance, institutional factors, the specificity of manufacturing capacity, while pointing to that these issues are not purely conjuncturally limited, but part and parcel of the way capitalism reproduces itself generationally. And one of the things we try to argue, as I was mentioning earlier, is that low-waged work is not accidental to the way capitalism works, but part and parcel towards its continued reproduction, right? And as far as the living wage is important, it could be used as a heuristic tool to demonstrate this long-term trend, particularly in the Canadian context of 40 years of wage stagnation, right? There's also limitations as far as, as Mark was mentioning, they mentioned, Bill 148 in Ontario, which we might squabble over to what extent this was the result of an upswell of community-based movements and labor movements as opposed to a last gasp electoral kind of measure after 15 years of governance. We might squabble on that difference, but it does show the limitations and how the stroke of a pen can erode this. And I think that points to this bigger question which is in the absence of a different, not only of just different types of policies, but a different type of politics, and even dare I say, anti-capitalist politics in the way historically various movements have recognized that these ways are systemic to the reproduction of capitalism, have pushed for this recognition. I think unless we start to think about the role of the state in the reproduction of this and how capital and the state are continually attacking these different mechanisms through which we've been able to ameliorate work, which again has always been geographically uneven and across space as well, right? Then I think that poses a different set of questions, which while this book and no book obviously has the answers to, at least points to in trying to develop the means through which we could develop kind of an emancipatory politics.
Right. Thank you. Shall we take the time for my last question, or what do you think?
What are we at?
We're at 4:08.
4:08. Yeah, maybe just quick. Maybe let's just have a quick go around.
Yeah, quick. I would like that. I would like that. Because the focus that the GLRC has taken this year is work, labor, and climate action. And so I wonder if we could just quickly hear from each of you, maybe 30 seconds or a minute each, on how the climate crisis fits into all of this. And I'll just mention briefly that Leah Skinner, who is the director of the Climate Jobs Institute at Cornell University, she gave an inspiring keynote address last week at our annual John Alene Lecture on Global Labor. And she made the argument that unions and working people need to tackle both the racial wealth gap crisis in the US, but Canada won't be outdone on much of anything that the US does, and also the climate crisis. So these two dual crises that she sees. So that we need to win good climate jobs that prioritize those who are disproportionately precariously employed. So what do you think about that argument? And how does that fit? How does the climate crisis fit with the labor crisis that we see here in Canada? John, do you want to start us off?
Well, I thought it was very inspiring. And I mean, the work that Leah has been doing, as well as now that they have a Climate Jobs National Resource Center. I think there's 14 climate jobs coalitions currently on the go across the United States. They've had major victories in places like New York and Illinois, Rhode Island, where not only have they won massive public investments in renewable energy and public transportation, building efficiency, but they've also, unions have been leading, as well as many environmental groups and other community groups, have been pushing for that those all have labor standards, that people get unionized jobs, that they get apprentice training. And that's the amazing thing, because you're not only getting public investments needed to actually deal with the climate crisis and transition the economy, but you're also getting good jobs, and you're getting people who are getting the the protection and the training and the wages necessary to realize a much better life. And I think combining those two and doing it in that way, and doing it in a popular way, and making it that it's about people's jobs, it's about their livelihoods, it's about their communities. Well, this is all old-time populism. And by having labor take the lead on this, I think it's tremendously inspiring, in terms of trying to move that forward together. Does it provide all the solutions? No, it doesn't. But it's a heck of a good first step, because once you can do that, I think then you can begin to push in political terms for something even better, right? Better than the Inflation Reduction Act, right? Something that does, is equivalent to a Green New Deal, right? Where you do have job guarantees and you do actually have a more equal society. And I think by having those first steps, that's your pathway to opening up a different kind of politics.
Great, thank you. Andie, I'm going to suggest we turn it to you, and then we can just go down the line here to finish off.
Sure. So unfortunately, I missed the talk, but I do think the climate crisis provides. I'm hopeful that the climate crisis provides an opening for us, both as a society and as political actors, to rethink what work and production and consumption look like in our society. And I know that's going to be a very slow change. We have some very entrenched models of that. But if we can disrupt cycles of consumption, we can disrupt cycles of work and capitalist production, hopefully in a positive way. I know I have been engaged recently in quite a bit of work around young people, and young people's attitudes towards work is changing. And in part, that is motivated by their anxieties about the future, right? Their anxieties about what the world is going to look like in 20 years or in 30 years or in 50 years when they might retire or not have a world to retire into. So I think there's certainly amazing political opportunities there. There's also a real resistance to change. And I think the next decade is going to be really interesting in terms of seeing whether both unions and governments and progressive groups are going to be able to leverage the openings caused by climate change and climate disasters and the climate crisis to force a rethink to the way we produce and consume as a society.
Thank you. Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a tricky one for me. I spent a lot of time in class and students and graduate students debating this topic. I'm a little bit skeptical of just transition as a concept. I don't think it clearly identifies what exactly we're transitioning to. Are we transitioning to a greener economy that's still capitalist, fragmented, and inherently unequal? Are we transitioning to a green-washed economy rather than a green economy? There's so many contradictions. I mean, the big example I bring up with students is that Margaret Thatcher, in some circles in the UK, is considered an environmentalist because she shut down the coal mines. There was no just transition for coal workers, but she did reduce coal production in the UK. That's the kind of contradictions we're living with. If we transition away from combustion-based fuel engines in cars, but start building electric cars that are made with carcinogenic properties and batteries. I mean, all of these things have to be thought through, and I just don't know if the concepts we're working with now, they're only starting to be popular. Green New Dealism, just transition. I don't know if they're powerful enough for what we need. And that's, I guess, what's a little bit worrying. We may need something that's much more broadly transformative and radical.
Thank you. Carlo.
Yeah, I'll just add, we've all implicitly mentioned this in a variety of ways, but it is impossible to separate in practice the low wage and precarious work as being relational and foundational to the explosion of the billionaire class, right? Which has only amplified in the context of COVID. One line of research, which I'm particularly interested in and just, in the midst of finishing on my data collection, is around short and compressed work weeks. Colloquially, the 40 work week. In a number of ways, both remote work and 40 work weeks have been promoted as reducing the consumption of greenhouse gases. And this remains to be seen to what extent it may reduce, right? Like lessening, transportation, car sitting, idling in traffic, and so forth, and these, usage. So it's an open question. It's inevitably tied to how the future of work is developing, but it is no doubt something. Work is never static; it's consistently evolving, and I think it's up to us as researchers and everyone generally to envision how these things can be remade in more democratic and potentially progressive ways.
Thanks. Okay, I'll be really brief and just, I guess, probably following on the theme of tensions and contradictions that are present in some of the current and maybe more mainstream environmental politics that we're seeing. I think one way of understanding the climate crisis relates to the fact that we live in a world that where we have an economy that is not based around producing goods and providing services that are oriented towards social needs, right? They're oriented towards generating profit. And so until we reach a point where we live in a world where we're producing and providing on the basis of social need, we're likely to continue to live in some version of a climate crisis. The car battery example is just one fascinating way of just seeing some of these contradictions, whereby green jobs in a green economy could mean people mining for lithium, working in lithium mines, and then working in car factories dealing with lithium mines. And that to me seems just to lead to yet another crisis. And so I think until we can think our ways out of that, which I think is what a number of us are reflecting on in these comments, until we can think our way out of that and build a way out of that, this climate crisis will continue in one form or another.
Okay, I'll make two distinct comments building on something that Andie said and also something that Steve said. When I was an undergraduate, just a couple of years ago, I'll never forget when I took a class on feminisms and environments with Professor Margaret Hobbs. And she took us on a grocery store trip. We were studying we were studying social welfare, but she didn't call it that. We walked around the grocery store and we looked at what a single parent, a single mother could afford in the grocery store with a particular budget. And one of the things that was so striking at that time was the kind of environmental costs that people who are living on low wages face. So they have to buy juice boxes or whatever it is, and there's a huge wastage problem. Like think about single-use plastics because they're the cheapest thing, or they have to buy canned goods because they can't afford the fresh. And so, I think that speaks to Andie's comment about thinking about consumption and Steve's comment about how he feels a great deal of contradiction. Like you, I feel a great contradiction. So I think we want to think about like consumption in a very progressive way that thinks about work and care and community in terms of thinking about green jobs. And it is to our own peril if we don't think about it in that way. And my second comment is about scale, which is really something that Steve was talking about. And maybe it's also about thinking about the scale of our action. So Steve talked about the airports, and Andie and I have studied this, at a different level. But if we thought about different sites of action around reducing carbon footprint, like take the federally regulated private sector, for example, and we thought about road transport or rail transport, there could be examples of model areas, industries, domains where we could sort of pilot these kinds of things, because a lot of the people that are in these jobs they're in precarious jobs, and they are and that are reproducing major problems with our carbon footprint. So if we thought about sites of that sort, that might be an airport, or it might be where we sort of piloted, as you were sort of maybe implying, Steve, where we piloted reducing hours, and we piloted a $25 minimum wage or living wage, as you were suggesting, and as was Carlo and as does John Shields. If we did that, then we might actually be able to sort of get at this, the problem, the nexus of consumption and production that of course Laura was talking about last week too.
Great, thank you. So we have a few minutes to open it up to your questions here in the room or on Zoom. For those of you attending by Zoom, you can put your questions in the chat, and then I will read them. And I think in the interest of time, do please record your questions in the chat. If we don't have time to get to all of your questions, we will record them, and perhaps the authors would be willing to receive your questions another way and respond to you.
So you're assigning us homework?
I am, yeah, because everybody's going to have lots of questions. For those of you in the room, you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you and try to get to as many questions as we can. We'll turn on the overhead microphone so that people on Zoom can hear you. That's always the challenge with a hybrid event. So I open it up to your questions, comments for our panelists. Sure.
Question, I mean, it's broad, but what the heck? What is the one tangible thing each of you would recommend that either a union or policymaker or activist organization could do to change labor law or something equally tangible to improve the situation? Say, well, what tangible thing is doable in the next 3 years?
First, engage with the new sustainable jobs plan. It's the first time in Canadian history that suddenly you had a proposal to say, guess what, workers are going to be at the table with business and government saying, these are the things we need to do, these are the things we need to build, and this is the way we have to do it. We need to get unions at those tables, and we have to have unions make sure that they have the resources and the knowledge and strategy to be able to use those tables well. So, the first thing I would certainly recommend. It's a huge opportunity. We have to, triple our infrastructure for renewable energy. We have to actually create building efficiency for millions of buildings. Well, the only way we're going to do that is massive public investment. Also, we have to make sure that people are going to do it sustainably, that the materials are sustainable, and that people get good jobs out of it. So that would be certainly my focus in terms of trying to win some of those good climate jobs and deal with inequality gaps.
Anybody else? Steven, yeah.
Something I think is always important, especially for unions, we can direct the unions, is the table that they haven't put on the table yet. And at the very least, they get leverage if they have to take them off the table, but at least they're introduced to the discussion. Climate change language making its way through health and safety negotiations is actually something that has worked, has been inroads made. But starting to really think broadly, negotiating for what kind of community benefits can your employer provide beyond just your members. Putting things into discussion again that spreads things out beyond just what were traditional white narrow bread and butter issues.
I thought John would use the opportunity to say, buy this book.
He did it. One of the curiosities, I teach a class, law, labor, and the state, where we go to the three regimes of work law as far as labor law concerned in Canada. And given this has been a topic, low wages and living wage movements I've been writing about. I start the first week by asking students how many of them would be in favor of raising the minimum wage, and I'm always blown away. One of my students is here, pretend he can speak to this. Is that I'm always blown away when I ask this question, an overwhelming majority says this would be terrible public policy. Job losses, our hours would be cut back, and that maybe tends to shift a little bit as the course goes on. But I do think asking these types of questions, first of all, let me step back. I'll say the one concrete thing we can do is that I think we should be encouraging, especially younger workers, particularly those in the private sector, broadly defined, think about starting a union in the workplace, because it is something that was much more common previously, but something that's a little less common today. And I think we should be encouraging that at every opportunity we can, and facilitating in their classes and our writing and so forth. But I do think we should have uncomfortable conversations as well, because there's a lot of times we often gloss over things for the sake of moving forward, but I think we do have to have those uncomfortable conversations sometimes in both unionized and non-unionized environments. And I think that could be one way towards concretely we can think about how to strategize together.
I think one of the things that came through in the section in our chapter that talked about COVID was the integration of working life with life outside of work, and how that sometimes these things are so deeply connected and blended in so many ways. And so I think in terms of one concrete thing And I think some workers' movements already do this, but maybe it's something that could be broadened. Is to just highlight the ways in which the working conditions that people have are connected to so many other aspects of life. The issues that a particular group of workers may be facing in their workplace are issues that resonate in multiple ways through communities. And showing those connections, whether it's around paid sick days, whether it's around living wages, etc., how this is not just the issue of a group of workers in their workplace, but something that resonates throughout the community. I think is one thing that it is being done, but certainly could be done on a wider scale.
At the risk of being repetitive, I'd say enforce labor standards, make it easier to organize a union, not just encourage young people to organize it, but make it more possible. I mean, there's some obvious things like card check certification, like easy things, at least in policy terms, maybe not politically. And of course, we haven't spent much time because none of us authored the chapters on this subject around temporary migrant work. But obviously, the status now campaigns, we're dealing with qualitative labor shortages. Like people, status now is like absolutely integral to addressing a lot of these questions. And the final question that Luann asked, but we weren't speaking about that subject, but it just seems to me to be absolutely integral. Yeah. Andie?
So just to follow up, I mean, it's quite clear we have a labor shortage. It's quite clear that labor shortages are particularly exacerbated in sectors where wages are low. And I mean, the collective strategy is not to fill those sectors, right? To force an upward movement on wages and working conditions in order to make better jobs. If there are fewer workers, we have more leverage and more bargaining power. And I think creating a collective discussion about that would go a long way to sort of increasing worker power in general.
Great, thank you. There is one question in the chat. We're going to save it and record it, and I'll send it to the panelists. And Calvin, if you're okay with that, people can respond. The panelists can respond to you privately. If you can just include also your contact information. Maybe some of the panelists know you, I'm not sure. We do have books for sale here. Can you stay for a few extra minutes? Thank you. So before I close things off and invite people to go buy books, John, I'll give you an opportunity to have kind of a second last word.
Well, I do want to thank you again and the Global Labor Research Center, and thank Roger so much for hosting us and putting the launch together, right? It's really very much appreciated, right? And I think it's a lovely thing to do, and I think it's a lovely way to sort of get out and talk about the ideas that we need and how we sort of move forward together, right? I think this is a great opportunity. I also just want to thank, since it is hybrid, I want to thank some of the people who are behind the book, the editor, and includes the press, Randy Schmidt, Dyer, their help, and they sort of piloted the project through it. This book would have been possible. And then other people getting behind there, David Mitchell, that moved lately, who's editing and patience with our writing and academic writing to try to make this that everything you enjoy and read was indispensable. I definitely want to thank them as well.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you to each of you, each of the authors here with us today for a rich discussion. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for attending, all of you online as well. So there are books for sale at the back of the room there. There are also books, other books written by members of this group here, esteemed group here at the front. So please do take time to take a look and enjoy some refreshments. Hadger has provided links on the GLRC event page to these books that are for sale here, and has also shared it or will share it in the chat. So you can purchase the books as well as other books by our panelists. thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.